Archduke Franz Ferdinand is remembered for one thing: his death. As the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, his assassination on June 28, 1914, was the spark that ignited the First World War, a catastrophe that claimed millions of lives and shattered empires. But to see him as merely the first victim of a global conflict is to miss the profound ironies of his story. This was a man who might have saved the very empire his death destroyed. He was a stubborn reformer with a radical plan to pacify the ethnic tensions tearing his country apart. He was one of the foremost voices for peace in a government dominated by warmongers. And he was a devoted husband whose epic battle to marry the woman he loved against the rigid rules of the Habsburg court defined his life and ultimately led him to his fatal appointment in Sarajevo. To understand Franz Ferdinand, one must understand his world, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the surface, Vienna was the cultural center of Europe, but inside it was an ancient multi-ethnic structure in the process of settling. At its head was Emperor Franz Joseph I, who reigned for 66 years, a symbol of slow redemption, hotelled by countless personal tragedies, and resistant to all the changes of the modern world. The political structure of the empire, the dual monarchy compromise of 1867, was a lively new one. It divided power between ethnic Germans and Hungarians, but also coerced and sprayed millions of other minorities, especially Slavs, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs. Nationalism was seething, transforming the country into a cauldron waiting to explode. The latest focal point was the Balkans. This was where Austria Hungary faced Serbia head-on. Serbia, with its ambition to unite all the South Slavs into one nation, Yugoslavia, posed a mortal threat to Austria Hungary, which had essentially ruled over millions of Slavs. Austria Hungary's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, a Serb-dominated region, turned the enemy into a powder keg. This was the complex, fragile, and dangerous world into which Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, was introduced. And he had his own radical ideas for how to deal with this fever. Into this world of gilded cages and simmering resentments, Franz Ferdinand was born in 1863. He was the eldest son of Archduke Karl Ludwig, the younger brother of the reigning Emperor Franz Joseph. His childhood, spent in the palaces of Vienna and the family estate of Archstetten, was a typical one for a Habsburg archduke, a cocoon of immense privilege, but also one of emotional distance and crushing formality. His days were rigidly scheduled, filled with lessons in languages, history, and military strategy, all designed to mold him into a proper, if minor, pillar of the dynasty. His father, Karl Ludwig, was a deeply pious and good-natured man, but not a particularly strong influence. His mother, Princess Maria Annunziata of Bourbon-Two Sicilies, was frail and often ill, dying of tuberculosis when Franz Ferdinand was only 7 years old. The task of raising him and his siblings fell to a series of tutors, and later a stern stepmother, Maria Theresa of Portugal. From a young age, Franz Ferdinand developed a personality that set him apart from his peers. He was not gregarious or charming. He was intensely private, prone to fits of temper, and possessed a deeply ingrained stubbornness. He held a withering contempt for the fawning sycophants and the endless, meaningless ceremonies that defined life at the Viennese court. This made him few friends, and earned him a reputation for being difficult and aloof. He was, in short, a serious young man in a world that often valued style over substance. But for the first quarter-century of his life, Franz Ferdinand's difficult personality was of little consequence to the empire. He was a secondary figure, living in the long shadow of his cousin, the heir to the throne, Crown Prince Rudolf. Rudolf was everything Franz Ferdinand was not: handsome, popular, intellectually brilliant, and a celebrated progressive. He corresponded with liberal thinkers across Europe, clashed with his conservative father over the future of the monarchy, and was seen by many as the empire's best hope for modernization. Franz Ferdinand, meanwhile, embarked on the standard career path for an archduke, the military. He rose through the ranks, proving to be a competent, if demanding, officer. His future seemed set: a lifetime of comfortable, respectable obscurity in the service of the crown. Then on the 30th of January 1889, the secure, predictable world of the Habsburg dynasty was shattered forever. At a remote imperial hunting lodge called Mayerling, the brilliant, troubled Crown Prince Rudolf and his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, were found dead. The official story, a hastily concocted fiction for a horrified public, was that the Crown Prince had died of a heart attack. But the truth was far darker and more scandalous. It was a murder-suicide. Rudolf had shot his young lover before turning the gun on himself. The Mayerling incident was a cataclysm. For the aging Emperor Franz Joseph, it was the most devastating personal blow in a life already filled with tragedy. The loss of his only son and heir broke something deep within him. For the empire, it was a dynastic crisis of the first order. The hope of a generation, the man who was meant to guide the ancient monarchy into the 20th century, was gone. The line of succession, which had seemed so secure, was now thrown into chaos. With Rudolf dead, the heir to the throne was now Franz Ferdinand's father, the unassuming Archduke Karl Ludwig. But Karl Ludwig was already in his late 50s and had no desire to rule. He almost immediately renounced his succession rights in favor of his eldest son. And just like that, the quiet, brooding Franz Ferdinand was, to his own astonishment, the new heir presumptive to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is difficult to overstate the psychological shock this must have been. One day, he was a minor archduke with a clearly defined limited future. The next, the destiny of 50 million people and the survival of a 600-year-old dynasty rested squarely on his shoulders. The Viennese court, which had largely ignored him, now scrutinized his every move. He was no longer just Franz Ferdinand. He was the successor, a role he had never been groomed for, and for which his reserved, prickly personality seemed utterly unsuited. He had inherited a destiny that was not his own, a future defined by his cousin's tragic end. But fate, it seemed, had yet another cruel twist in store. Just as he was beginning to grapple with his new reality, his body betrayed him. In the mid-1890s, he developed a persistent, racking cough. He began losing weight, and his legendary energy faded. The diagnosis from the imperial physicians confirmed his greatest fears and the court's darkest whispers. He had contracted the same disease that had killed his mother. It was tuberculosis. In the late 19th century, tuberculosis, the White Plague, was a virtual death sentence. There was no cure, no effective treatment beyond the vague prescription of rest and fresh air. The court immediately began to write him off. It was whispered that he was doomed, that he would never live to see the throne. His rivals began to maneuver, and many officials started to pay court to his younger, healthier, and far more dissolute brother, Archduke Otto, a notorious womanizer known as Otto the Handsome. Once again, Franz Ferdinand found himself an outcast, his future declared null and void, this time by his own mortality. He was an heir in name only, a ghost haunting the corridors of the Hofburg Palace. But Franz Ferdinand was, above all else, a fighter. He refused to passively accept his fate. He had always hated the stifling atmosphere of Vienna, and now the city felt like a tomb. Against the advice of many court physicians, he decided he would not stay in Austria to die. Instead, he would use his vast personal wealth to embark on a journey around the world, a grand tour of unprecedented scale, in a desperate gamble for his health. In December of 1892, he set sail from Trieste aboard the Austro-Hungarian Navy cruiser, the SMS Kaiserin Elizabeth. For the next year and a half, he would be a man on the run, from his disease, from his suffocating destiny, and from the court that had already written his obituary. The journey was an extraordinary undertaking, a voyage that would profoundly change the man and his vision of the world. His first major stop was India. Here, the future ruler of one multi-ethnic empire got a first-hand look at how another, the British Raj, was managed. He was both impressed by the efficiency of British administration and critical of their aloofness from the local population. It was in India that his obsession with hunting found its grandest stage. He hunted elephants and tigers with a ferocious intensity, a pursuit that seemed to be an externalization of his own fight against the disease consuming him from within. From India, his journey took him through the Dutch East Indies, to Australia, and then to Japan. Japan in 1893 was a nation in the throes of a remarkable transformation, the Meiji Restoration. He saw a society that had managed to modernize its industry and military at breathtaking speed while still preserving its ancient cultural traditions. For an heir to an empire terrified of change, it was a powerful lesson that modernity and tradition did not have to be mutually exclusive. He was so enchanted by Japanese art and design that he had a complex Japanese garden created at one of his castles. A piece of that journey he would keep with him for the rest of his life. The final leg of his journey took him across the Pacific to North America. He landed in Vancouver and crossed Canada by rail before entering the United States. America was a revelation to him. He was an archduke, a product of a society built on heredity and hierarchy, and he was now confronted with the raw, chaotic, and vibrant energy of a democratic republic. He was awed by the natural beauty of Yellowstone and Yosemite, which he explored on horseback, but he was most struck by the nation's relentless commercial drive. In a letter, he described the American obsession with money as a kind of madness. Yet he couldn't help but be impressed by the dynamism and the can-do spirit of the people he met. He saw a country that was a true melting pot of peoples, a nation of immigrants from all over Europe, including many from his own empire, who were being forged into a new identity. It offered a stark and perhaps unsettling contrast to his own empire, which seemed on the verge of being torn apart by the very same ethnic diversity. In October of 1893, after circumnavigating the globe, Franz Ferdinand finally returned to Austria. The journey had been a resounding success. The sea air and the mental stimulation had worked a miracle. His lungs had begun to heal. The tuberculosis was in remission. He had faced down death and won, a victory that cemented his already formidable willpower and his powerful sense of destiny. He returned a changed man. He had left as a sick, sidelined heir and came back as a worldly, self-assured figure with a global perspective that no one else in the Habsburg dynasty possessed. He had seen firsthand the workings of other great powers, the challenges of colonialism, and the power of modern industry. His natural conservatism was now tempered with a pragmatic understanding that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had to adapt, or it would die. He had survived his illness and outlasted the court's predictions of his demise. He was stronger, more determined, and more ready than ever to claim his place as the future ruler of the empire. But his greatest battle was yet to come. It would not be fought against disease or political rivals, but against the unbending will of his uncle, the emperor, for the one thing he now desired more than the throne itself, the love of a woman the court deemed unworthy. Having stared down his own mortality and returned to Austria with a renewed sense of purpose, Franz Ferdinand was a changed man. He was no longer the sickly, sidelined nephew the court had written off, but a formidable figure, the undisputed heir whose will had been forged in the crucible of his illness. He had won the battle for his life. Now that same unbending determination was about to be aimed at an even more arduous struggle, not for political influence, but for the one thing he now desired more than the throne itself, the battle for his heart. In the rigid, almost theological world of Habsburg dynastic law, the marriage of an heir was not a personal matter. It was an act of state, a transaction designed to secure alliances, and above all, to produce heirs of equal royal blood. The list of potential brides for Franz Ferdinand was short and exclusive, a curated selection of European princesses. For a man as private, passionate, and contemptuous of courtly games as Franz Ferdinand, this was a deeply galling prospect. The stage for this new conflict was set in the late 1890s at a society ball in Prague. It was there he met Countess Sophie Chotek. Sophie was a lady-in-waiting to the Archduchess Isabella. She came from a distinguished and ancient Bohemian noble family, but they had long since lost their wealth. Crucially, in the cruel calculus of royal bloodlines, the Choteks were not a reigning or formerly reigning dynasty. They were simply aristocrats. In the eyes of the Habsburg court, this made her utterly ineligible. She was intelligent, cultured, dignified, and beautiful, but she was, for dynastic purposes, a nobody. Franz Ferdinand was immediately captivated. Where the princesses he was expected to court were often dull and vapid, products of an insular upbringing, Sophie was witty, mature, and possessed a quiet strength. A secret courtship began. The Archduke started making frequent visits to the Teschen Palace in Pressburg, now Bratislava. Everyone, especially the ambitious Archduchess Isabella, assumed he was there to woo one of her 8 daughters. Isabella was practically planning the wedding, dreaming of which of her girls would become the future empress. For several years, the couple managed their clandestine romance with masterful discretion. They communicated through secretly exchanged letters, often using Sophie's personal maid as a go-between. Their secret rendezvous were carefully orchestrated. A game of tennis became one of their few opportunities for a private conversation, a moment of normalcy in a life of constant observation. Franz Ferdinand, a man who had felt isolated for much of his life, had finally found a kindred spirit, a partner who understood him and was not intimidated by his rank or his temper. He had fallen deeply and irrevocably in love, but secrets in the gossipy world of the imperial court have a very short lifespan. The moment of discovery was pure drawing room drama. One day, at the Teschen Palace, a servant found Archduke Franz Ferdinand's gold pocket watch, which he had accidentally left behind. It was given to Archduchess Isabella. Her maternal and dynastic ambitions piqued. She couldn't resist the temptation to look inside. The watch contained a small locket, and she opened it, fully expecting to see the face of her eldest daughter, Marie Christine. Instead, her eyes fell upon a smiling portrait of her lady-in-waiting, Countess Sophie Chotek. Isabella's fury was volcanic. She felt she had been personally betrayed and made a fool of. The scandal exploded. Sophie was dismissed from her position immediately and cast out in disgrace. The court was set ablaze with gossip and outrage. The affair was no longer a secret romance, it was a public crisis. Now the full weight of the dynasty came crashing down on Franz Ferdinand. The emperor was appalled. He summoned his nephew and flatly forbade the union. It was not a request, it was an imperial command. The very idea was an affront to the sacred laws of the House of Habsburg, which stated that a valid dynastic marriage could only be contracted with a member of a reigning or formerly reigning house. To marry a mere countess would be to pollute the bloodline and create a constitutional crisis. His ministers, his family, the entire imperial establishment lined up against him. They painted lurid pictures of the consequences. The dynasty would be weakened. The fiercely proud Hungarian nobility would never accept a non-royal as their queen. It would set a dangerous precedent for other archdukes. They pressured him, they threatened him, they cajoled him. They presented him with a parade of suitable royal princesses, hoping to distract him. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the man they were dealing with. This was not the young, uncertain archduke of a decade earlier. This was a man who had stared down death, who had traveled the world, and whose stubbornness had hardened into an immovable resolve. His love for Sophie, combined with his visceral hatred for the court's hypocrisy, fueled his defiance. He refused to consider any other bride. He declared that if he could not marry Sophie, he would never marry at all. For years, the stalemate continued. Franz Ferdinand used every weapon at his disposal. He pleaded with the emperor, arguing that after his long illness and the burdens of his position, he deserved some measure of personal happiness. He enlisted the support of powerful allies, including Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who, being romantics themselves, wrote letters to the old emperor, urging him to relent. Finally, by the turn of the century, the aging emperor realized his nephew would not break. Worn down by years of relentless pressure, and perhaps fearing that his heir would simply wait until he was dead to do as he pleased, Franz Joseph gave in. But his permission came at a terrible price, one designed to be a permanent and public humiliation for both Franz Ferdinand and the woman he loved. On the 28th of June, 1900, a date that would later take on an infinitely more tragic significance, Franz Ferdinand was summoned to the Hofburg Palace. In the Privy Council chamber, before the emperor, all the archdukes, the highest officials of the court, and the prime ministers of both Austria and Hungary, he was forced to perform an act of ritual degradation. In the flickering candlelight of the ancient hall, his voice clear and steady, he had to read aloud an oath of renunciation. He was being granted permission to contract a morganatic marriage. The term comes from a medieval German word meaning morning gift, the gift a husband gave his wife the morning after their wedding, which was all the property she could ever inherit. It was a marriage of unequals. Sophie would be his wife, but she would never be his equal. She could never become empress. She would never share his rank or titles. And, most cruelly of all, he had to swear that any children born of their union would be stripped of all dynastic rights, forever barred from succession to the throne. He was forced to sacrifice his own unborn children's birthright for the woman he loved. After reading the oath, he had to sign the document, his signature sealing the bargain. He had won the right to marry, but the dynasty had exacted its pound of flesh. Their wedding, a few days later on July 1st, was not the grand imperial celebration it should have been. It was a quiet, almost sad affair. The emperor did not attend. None of Franz Ferdinand's brothers were there. Of the entire imperial family, only his stepmother, Maria Theresa, and her 2 daughters showed up to support them. It was a wedding befitting a minor country nobleman. Not the future ruler of a great empire? Sophie was given the personal title of Princess of Hohenberg, later elevated to duchess, but it did little to soften the blow. The court never truly accepted Sophie. For the rest of her life, she was subjected to 1,000 petty calculated slights, a form of psychological torture by protocol. At state dinners, she was separated from her husband and seated at a table far down the hall, after the last and most minor archduchess. In court processions, she was forced to walk alone, far behind her husband and the rest of the imperial family. At the theater, she could not share the royal box with him. These constant humiliations were a source of deep and abiding fury for Franz Ferdinand. He grew to despise the Viennese court, which he privately called the Viper's Pit, and retreated from it whenever possible. He and Sophie found their sanctuary far from Vienna, at their magnificent estate, Konopište Castle in Bohemia. Here, behind the castle walls, surrounded by vast forests and rose gardens, they could finally build the normal family life they craved. They were utterly devoted to each other and to their 3 children. Franz Ferdinand, so often portrayed as a grim and short-tempered autocrat, was by all accounts a doting and playful father. He would get down on the floor to play with his sons, and he took immense pride in his daughter's education. The family's daily life was a world away from the stiff formality of Vienna. They took walks together, worked in their gardens, and lived not as a future imperial family, but simply as a family. Konopište was their fortress against a hostile world, a private paradise where Sophie was not just the Duchess of Hohenberg, but the beloved mistress of the house. And he was not the heir to an empire, but simply a husband and a father. This deep protective love for his wife and children became the central animating force of his life, a love that would, in the end, lead them both to their fatal appointment in Sarajevo. This happiness in his domestic sanctuary, built as a fortress against the Viennese court, became the true center of Franz Ferdinand's world. But the fulfillment he found in private only sharpened his contempt for the dysfunctional public sphere he was set to inherit. This deep personal satisfaction, combined with his isolation from the sycophantic inner circle in Vienna, allowed him to see the empire's flaws with a cold, clear eye. As the Inspector General of the Armed Forces and the designated successor, his private life as a devoted husband and father was now inextricably linked to his public role as a determined political reformer, one who was secretly forging radical plans to save the very system that had caused him and his wife so much pain. He gathered around him a brain trust of trusted military officers, diplomats, and academics, a group that came to be known as the Belvedere Circle, or his shadow cabinet. These men were his intellectual sparring partners and the architects of the sweeping reforms he intended to implement the moment he ascended the throne. Unlike his uncle, the static and tradition-bound emperor, Franz Ferdinand was convinced that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had to evolve dramatically or it would perish. He was no liberal Democrat. He was a staunch autocrat, a devout Catholic, and a firm believer in the divine right of the Habsburg monarchy. But he was also a pragmatist who saw the fatal flaw at the heart of the empire, the nationalities problem. His solution was revolutionary. He intended to dismantle the very foundation of the dual monarchy, the 1867 compromise that gave the Hungarians so much power. In its place, he envisioned a federalized state. The most famous of his plans was known as Trialism. It proposed creating a third major political entity within the empire, a South Slavic kingdom, likely centered on Croatia, which would unite the empire's Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes under one semi-autonomous government. This new kingdom would have the same status as Austria and Hungary, transforming the dual monarchy into a triple monarchy. An even more ambitious version of his plan, often called the United States of Greater Austria imagined a federation of up to 15 self-governing states, each based on a major nationality. Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Romanians, and others would all have their own local governments, schools, and cultural institutions, all living under the unifying authority of the Habsburg Emperor. His goal was to defuse the ticking time bomb of nationalism by granting the empire's restless minorities the autonomy they craved, thereby securing their loyalty to the dynasty. This vision, however logical it may seem, made him powerful and dangerous enemies. The ruling elite in Hungary were horrified. Franz Ferdinand's plans would mean the dismemberment of the historic kingdom of Hungary, stripping them of their dominance over the millions of Slavs and Romanians living within their borders. They saw him as their mortal enemy and secretly worked to undermine him at every turn. But the most tragic and ironic opposition came from the very people his plans were, in a way, designed to help. For radical Serbian nationalists whose ultimate goal was to break the South Slavs away from the empire and unite them into a greater Serbia, Franz Ferdinand's reforms were a terrifying threat. An oppressive, hated Austria was a far better recruiting tool for their cause than a reformed, federalized empire where Slavs had rights and representation. A contented Slavic population would be the death knell for their revolutionary dream. In a fatal twist of logic, the man who offered the best hope for a peaceful future for the empire's Slavs became the #1 target for a group of Serbian assassins. In foreign policy, Franz Ferdinand was equally at odds with the establishment. He was surrounded by a powerful faction of war hawks, led by the influential and aggressive chief of staff Konrad von Hötzendorf. Konrad was obsessed with the idea of a preventive war. He constantly pushed the emperor to launch preemptive military strikes against Serbia to crush the nationalist threat, and even against Italy, the empire's nominal ally. Franz Ferdinand consistently and forcefully opposed these reckless plans. He was the army's inspector general, and he knew its weaknesses better than anyone. He understood that a war with Serbia would not be a quick, localized conflict. It would inevitably draw in Serbia's great protector, the Russian Empire. "A war with Russia means the end of us," he once warned. "If we go after Serbia, Russia will back her, and then we shall have Russia on our hands." He saw that such a conflict would be a suicidal gamble for the fragile, multi-ethnic empire. Time and again, he used his influence with the aging emperor to block Konrad's plans for war. The great irony is that the leading voice for peace and caution within the Austro-Hungarian leadership would have his death become the ultimate justification for the very war he had struggled for years to prevent. Yet this Prince of Peace was a man of profound and unsettling contradictions. His most famous personal obsession was hunting, a passion that went far beyond sport and into the realm of mania. He meticulously recorded every single kill in his journals. His lifetime tally is staggering, almost incomprehensible: 272,511 animals. On a single day in 1893, he personally shot 2,140 birds. His estates, like Konopishte, were less nature preserves and more gigantic open-air slaughterhouses, managed for the sole purpose of providing him with a steady supply of targets. This obsessive slaughter stands in stark, disturbing contrast to the image of the devoted husband and loving father. How could a man capable of such tender affection also be capable of such relentless killing? Historians have speculated that it was a way to vent the immense frustrations of his public life, a need for absolute control in a world where he often felt powerless, or simply the all-consuming hobby of a man of his time and class, taken to a fanatical extreme. Whatever its root, this obsessive side of his personality reveals the deep complexities of his character, a thoughtful, forward-thinking reformer who was also a feudal throwback, a man of intense love and equally intense violence. In the early summer of 1914, an invitation arrived for the Archduke. General Oskar Potiorek, the military governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina, invited Franz Ferdinand to observe army maneuvers scheduled for the end of June. For Potiorek, it was a chance to curry favor with the heir and to showcase the supposed success of his administration in the restive province. For Franz Ferdinand, it was a welcome duty. It allowed him to escape Vienna, and crucially, it came with a rare perk. Because he would be attending in his official military capacity, the suffocating court protocols would be relaxed. His beloved wife, Sophie, could accompany him and be treated with the full honors befitting his station, appearing at his side throughout the public events. The timing, however, was a catastrophic blunder. The public visit to the city of Sarajevo was scheduled for June 28th. This was no ordinary day. For Serbian nationalists, it was St. Vitus's Day, or Vidovdan, the most sacred and mournful day in their national calendar. It was the anniversary of the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, where the medieval Serbian kingdom was defeated by the Ottoman Turks, ushering in centuries of foreign rule. To have the heir of the Austrian oppressor parade through their capital on this day of national defiance was seen by radicals as a deliberately calculated insult, a slap in the face. Warnings began to trickle in. The Serbian Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic, aware that nationalist cells were plotting something, instructed his ambassador in Vienna to pass on a vague message warning that a visit by the Archduke on that particular day might be dangerous. The warning was so undiplomatic and non-specific that the Austrian official who received it dismissed it as a scare tactic. Franz Ferdinand himself was fatalistic. When told of potential dangers, he reportedly remarked, "The dear Lord will decide what happens to me." The security arrangements for the visit were shockingly, almost criminally, negligent. Potiorek, eager to show that Bosnia was a peaceful, loyal province, wanted a light touch. Only 120 local policemen were assigned to guard the entire multi-mile parade route. The thousands of soldiers participating in the maneuvers just outside the city were ordered to remain with their units. The Archduke and Duchess would travel in a procession of open-topped cars, slow-moving targets for anyone with a weapon and a cause. Unbeknownst to the Archduke, a team of assassins was already in place, waiting for him. They were members of a revolutionary group called Young Bosnia, but they had been armed and trained by the Black Hand, the shadowy Serbian terrorist society, with deep ties to Serbian military intelligence. There were 7 of them stationed along the pre-published route. They were little more than boys, most of them still teenagers, impoverished students consumed by a self-destructive mix of nationalist ideology and, in many cases, terminal tuberculosis. They saw themselves as martyrs, ready to sacrifice their own short lives for the dream of a unified South Slavic nation. Their leader was a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip. The morning of June 28th dawned bright and sunny. At 10:10 a.m., the Archduke's 6-car motorcade set off from the train station. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were in the second car, a gref and stiff convertible with its top folded down. They smiled and waved at the crowds. The first 2 assassins along the route lost their nerve and failed to act. But as the motorcade passed the Kumuria Bridge, the third conspirator, Nedeljko Chabrinovich, stepped forward. He armed his bomb and hurled it directly at the Archduke's car. The driver saw the dark object flying towards them and hit the accelerator. The bomb bounced off the back of the car, rolling under the vehicle behind it, where it exploded with a deafening roar. It blew a crater in the street and wounded 2 officers in the following car and about 20 spectators. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were completely unharmed. Amid the smoke and confusion, Chabrinovich swallowed a faulty cyanide pill and jumped into the shallow Miljacka River. He was quickly dragged out and arrested. The plot, it seemed, had failed. The motorcade sped away to the planned reception at City Hall. Franz Ferdinand was incandescent with rage. When the flustered mayor tried to begin his welcoming speech, the Archduke cut him off. "Mr. Mayor," he seethed, "I come here as your guest, and you people greet me with bombs. It is outrageous." Sophie whispered something in his ear, and he managed to regain his composure, allowing the ceremony to conclude. A debate now ensued. The logical course of action was to leave the city immediately. But Franz Ferdinand, a man of immense pride and duty, refused to be chased away. He insisted they first visit the hospital to check on the officers wounded by the bomb. This decision, born of compassion and courage, would be his last. A new route was planned. The cars would drive straight back along the wide Appel Quay, avoiding the narrow side streets of the old city. But in the chaos and confusion of the moment, no one told the driver of the lead car or the Archduke's driver, Leopold Loika, of the change in plans. A dejected Gavrilo Princip, believing his chance was lost forever, had wandered down a side street, Franz Joseph Street. He stood on the pavement, perhaps contemplating what to do next, when he heard the sound of the approaching motorcade. He looked up, and to his absolute stunning disbelief, he saw the Archduke's gruff and stiff car, which should have gone straight, instead making a slow right turn off the Appel Quay, directly into his street. The governor, Potiorek, who was in the car with the couple, saw the mistake immediately. "What is this? This is the wrong way," he yelled. "We're supposed to go straight." The driver, Loika, slammed on the brakes. The car's engine stalled. He fumbled with the gear stick, trying to put the car into reverse. For a few agonizing, history-altering seconds, the grand convertible was a sitting duck, motionless, less than 5 feet away from the astonished assassin. This was the moment, the impossible, fatal coincidence. Princip raised his 9mm FN model 1910 pistol. He didn't hesitate. He fired 2 shots. The first bullet hit Sophie in the abdomen. She had instinctively turned towards her husband, and the bullet tore through the car door and into her side. She slumped forward, her face falling between her husband's knees, her white hat obscuring her from view. The second bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein and grazing his spine. For a moment, in the shocking silence after the pistol's cracks, no one seemed to comprehend what had happened. Then a thin stream of blood began to trickle from the Archduke's mouth. Count Herak, an officer riding on the car's running board, heard Franz Ferdinand's final desperate words, not a cry of pain for himself, but a plea for his wife. He turned to her slumped form, his voice a choked whisper. "Sophorel, Sophorel, don't die. Live for our children." He repeated the phrase, "It is nothing," over and over as his head slumped forward onto his chest. Within minutes, Sophie was dead. The Archduke died shortly after, on the way to the governor's residence. The 2 bullets had found their mark. The spark that would ignite the world had been struck. Those 2 sharp cracks echoed down the narrow street and into history, ending the lives of the Archduke and his Duchess in a matter of moments. But the sound did not stop there. It spread from the cobblestones of Sarajevo like a shock wave, traveling instantly along the telegraph wires to Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, and beyond. The immediate consequence was chaos and grief, but the aftershock would be a political crisis that would consume the continent. The personal tragedy of a murdered couple was about to transform into the impersonal geopolitical logic of ultimatums and mobilizations, as the sleepwalking leaders of Europe began the inexorable march toward the very catastrophe Franz Ferdinand had long feared. The 2 pistol shots on Franz Joseph Street shattered the sleepy morning air of Sarajevo, and with it, the long, uneasy peace of Europe. In the immediate chaos, Gavrilo Princip was seized by the crowd, nearly lynched before being taken into police custody. His cyanide pill failed just as his co-conspirators had. Within hours, the entire network of young assassins was rounded up. Their mission was, in their eyes, a complete success. The bodies of the Archduke and his Duchess were taken to the governor's residence, the Konak. There, they were laid out side by side, as the local authorities frantically telegraphed the news to Vienna. The first message was garbled, uncertain, but soon the horrific, unambiguous truth began to spread across the globe via the telegraph wires. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his wife had been murdered. Back at their idyllic home in Konopiste, the 3 children were playing in the garden. They were told there had been an accident and that their parents were hurt. The full, devastating truth was kept from them until their uncle arrived. Princess Sophie, the eldest at just 13, reportedly suspected the worst immediately. "Is Papa dead?" she asked. The moment they were told they were orphans, their protected, happy childhood came to an abrupt and brutal end. Their father, the future emperor, and their mother, the heart of their world, were gone. In Vienna, the reaction of the court was shockingly cold and formal. The news was a political crisis, of course, but there was little genuine grief for the difficult, reform-minded Archduke and his non-royal wife. Emperor Franz Joseph, now 83 years old, received the news while at his summer palace. He was stoic as ever, but his reported first words were not of personal loss, but of divine order being restored. Horrible. The Almighty cannot be provoked. A higher power has restored the order which I, unfortunately, was unable to maintain. For the old emperor, his nephew's morganatic marriage was a greater disruption to the natural order than his death. This coldness extended even to their final rites. The court in Vienna denied them a grand state funeral, arguing that such honors could not be extended to the Duchess of Hohenberg. After a brief, sparsely attended ceremony in the chapel of the Habsburg Palace, where, in a final act of protocol-driven cruelty, Sophie's coffin was placed on a lower level than her husband's. Their bodies were taken by train and then by a river ferry down the Danube to be buried. On a dark and stormy night, they were interred side by side at last in the crypt of Archstetten Castle, the home Franz Ferdinand had prepared for them, far from the viper's pit of Vienna. His will was clear. Since they could not rest together in the imperial crypt with the other Habsburgs, he would be buried with her in their own private tomb. A simple inscription on their sarcophagus reads, "United by the bond of marriage, united in a shared fate." While the family mourned, the gears of state began to grind, and the war party in Vienna, led by General Konrad von Hötzendorf, saw its chance. The assassination was the perfect pretext, the blank check they had long been waiting for to launch their preventive war against Serbia. But Austria Hungary was weak and could not act alone. It needed the backing of its powerful ally, Germany. On July 5th, a delegation was dispatched to Berlin to meet with Kaiser Wilhelm II. In a moment of colossal miscalculation, the Kaiser and his government offered Austria Hungary their unconditional support for any action it chose to take against Serbia. This was Germany's infamous blank check, a promise to back Austria, even if it meant war with Russia. The Germans believed a swift, decisive Austrian strike would call Russia's bluff. They gambled that the conflict could be contained. They were catastrophically wrong. Emboldened by German support, Austria Hungary spent the next few weeks drafting an ultimatum to Serbia. It was a list of 10 demands, deliberately engineered to be so humiliating that no sovereign nation could ever accept them. It was delivered to Belgrade on July 23rd, almost a month after the assassination. The world, which had begun to believe the crisis had passed, was stunned. In a desperate attempt to avoid war, Serbia accepted 9 of the 10 points, only rejecting the one that would have allowed Austrian police to operate on Serbian territory. It was not enough. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the shots were fired in Sarajevo, Austria Hungary declared war on Serbia. The first artillery shells began to fall on the Serbian capital of Belgrade. The ticking clock had run out. The dominoes began to fall with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. July 30th, Russia, seeing itself as the protector of the Slavs, ordered a general mobilization of its massive army to defend Serbia. August 1st, Germany, viewing the Russian mobilization as an act of war, declared war on Russia. The intricate, rigid war plans of the great powers, once set in motion, were nearly impossible to stop. August 3rd, Germany declared war on Russia's ally, France, and launched its armies westward, invading neutral Belgium as part of its Schlieffen Plan to achieve a quick victory. August 4th, Great Britain, honor-bound by a treaty to defend Belgian neutrality and unwilling to see France defeated, declared war on Germany. Within a single week, all the great powers of Europe were at war. The complex web of alliances built over decades to ensure a balance of power and keep the peace had instead become a finely tuned machine for global conflict, dragging the entire continent into a war that no single nation truly wanted, but which none had the wisdom or courage to prevent. The leaders of 1914 have been called the sleepwalkers, men who, blinded by arrogance, fear, and rigid military timetables, stumbled over the cliff's edge into the abyss, dragging their people with them. The war that followed was a cataclysm that ripped the heart out of Western civilization. The war to end all wars lasted for over 4 years and claimed between 15 and 22 million lives. It erased an entire generation of young men. It introduced the world to the industrial-scale horrors of the machine gun, poison gas, and relentless artillery bombardment. By the time the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world that Franz Ferdinand had known, the world of emperors and ancient dynasties, was gone forever. The Russian Empire had collapsed into Bolshevik revolution. The German Empire was overthrown. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered. And his own Austro-Hungarian Empire, the 600-year-old House of Habsburg, simply ceased to exist, splintering into a collection of small, weak, and squabbling new countries. The consequences of the war shaped the rest of the 20th century. The flawed peace treaties signed at Versailles bred resentments that would lead directly to the rise of Adolf Hitler and a Second World War, even more terrible than the first. The assassination in Sarajevo was not just the start of a war, it was the start of an entire age of conflict, ideology, and violence. And what of the 3 orphans left behind? Their titles were abolished, their properties confiscated by the new Czechoslovak state. They lived their lives in quiet exile, but the tragedies of the 20th century, which their parents' deaths had unleashed, were not finished with them. After the Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938, both Maximilian and Ernst, who were vocally anti-Nazi, were arrested. As enemies of the Reich, they were sent to the Dachau concentration camp. They spent the entire war as political prisoners, enduring years of brutal treatment. They survived, but their health was shattered. The sons of the man whose death started the First World War became victims of the Second. It is the final, crushing irony of Franz Ferdinand's story that he, the one powerful man in Vienna who had consistently warned against war, who had worked to block the militarists at every turn, had his death used as the ultimate excuse for the very catastrophe he predicted. The war hawks he despised got their war, and in winning it, they utterly destroyed the empire they claimed to be defending. The story of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie is therefore more than just a political trigger. It is a profound human tragedy that exposes the fragile, contingent nature of history. It reminds us that the grand, impersonal forces of nationalism and militarism are ultimately driven by the choices, flaws, and fateful decisions of individuals. It shows us how a story of love and defiance against a rigid court could end on a street corner in a provincial city, and in doing so, bring a whole world crashing down. Their story is a testament to how easily a civilization can unravel, how a future of peaceful reform can be stolen by 2 bullets, and how the line between a world at peace and a world in flames can be as thin as a driver's wrong turn, a stalled engine, and the last desperate words of a husband to his dying wife: "Live for our children." In the end, they could not. And because of that, millions of other children would grow up without their fathers, in a world forever scarred by the echo of 2 shots fired on a sunny June morning.